Bloodborne has recently turned 9 years old. Largely considered the best FromSoft title, although I think it's a little overrated. It's not hard to see why so many people want to see this remastered or ported to PC. I mean, who wouldn't want to exterminate the British and their pet dogs in 60 FPS? All jokes aside, Bloodborne is probably the hardest FromSoft game to date, owing to its fast-paced combat, limited healing in the early game, and receiving double damage if dodges are timed slightly off. The bosses of Bloodborne are no exception, and it wouldn't be surprising to see them dominate a top 10 ranking of the hardest bosses in FromSoft. Fittingly, the same could be said for a top 10 ranking of the best bosses. That being said, not all of them are fitting of such a title. As a matter of fact, several could be considered the worst. So with all that being said, which bosses encourage people to call Bloodborne a masterpiece, and which of them taint that title? This ranking will be based on what I like to call the castaway metric, meaning we're looking at the entire presentation, not just the fight itself. And before we begin this ranking, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. It's completely free, and it helps me to see what works and what doesn't. Also, please let me know your rankings in the comments. With all that out of the way, let's rank them. Number 22, Rom, the Vacuous Spider. What the f*** happened here? Firstly, spiders automatically get a 0 out of 10 when it comes to design and originality. There's nothing special or even interesting about triggering my arachnophobia. Secondly, remember when I said in my Elden Ring boss ranking that the Elden Beast was just a less shit version of this fight? It should come as no surprise that Rom is at the bottom of this list. I know there are 2 others worthy of that title, but we'll get to those soon. As for Rom, what even is there to say? The arena looks nice. That's about it. You're spending more time trying to fight off the spiders just to get to Rom. First third of the fight isn't too bad. You kill the spiders and get a good few hits on Rom. She'll do a few attacks if you stay up close too long, but nothing offensive. Then she teleports away, coming back with even more spiders. Now, not only do you have to fight off the spiders, but also be aware of Rom summoning meteors that can kill you very quickly. Then, when you get up close to Rom, she now has a very powerful AoE that can insta-kill you if you're not careful. Do these mechanics make the fight harder? Sure, I guess. Does that translate to a more fun boss fight?
Absolutely not!
Overall, it just makes for a really annoying experience. Sure, the lore is fine, so is the soundtrack, I guess. The run back isn't the best, but not the worst. Maybe I'm being a little harsh on this fight, but it's merited on the fact that I spent longer fighting enemies that weren't the boss, rather than the boss herself. Being both annoying and boring is impressive, but definitely not worth it. Number 21, The One Reborn. Why is it that Bloodborne has the absolute worst version of their own gimmick fights? Basic boss fights are amazing, but the gimmicks are genuinely the worst. The One Reborn is a shining example of that. People remember the Tower Knight from Demon's Souls, and they remember it as being a pretty fun puzzle boss. Now, imagine the archers in the Tower Knight arena could heal him. That's the One Reborn in a nutshell. The mages are a straight up annoyance, even worse than the spiders in the Rom boss fight. All they serve to do is make you do a little cleaning before fighting the boss itself. That fight is nowhere near as dynamic as the Tower Knight, as a lot of the attacks are just get off me mechanics to stop you kicking its ass. Or is it the torso? The design itself is pretty grotesque and perfectly fitting of the Bloodborne aesthetic, which is something. The music is quite good, that's another redeeming quality, but the run back is easily the worst one in the game. At some point in a FromSoft game, the levels get so tough and tedious that you end up just running past everything to get to the boss. This is the only time it really happens in Bloodborne, and you can probably see why. If I told you that the only reason why the One Reborn isn't at the very bottom was because it's not a spider, would you be surprised? Number 20, Living Failures. How many times have you heard, "Hey, they put me in the game," every time the Living Failures come up? That joke is more memorable than the boss itself. A DPS test with 4 of the same entities. Why does that sound familiar? Yeah, this is basically a worse version of the 4 Kings, because you're stuck with all 4 of them until the health bar reaches 0. This is basically the definition of a hit and run boss. Get a few hits in, then run off before they do something stupidly OP. It might seem a bit harsh putting this at the 3rd worst, but Bear in mind that this is the DLC, not just that, but it's largely considered the best DLC in FromSoft by many. Should a DLC of such caliber really have a boss fight like this? Imagine if Artorias of the Abyss had Pinwheel between Artorias and Manus. That's basically Living Failures in a nutshell. A forgettable boss in between two of the best fights in the game. The run back isn't good, even with the elevator shortcut, and the designs just look like a recycled version of the Celestial Emissary. I guess that's fitting, considering the lore, but still quite underwhelming. Speaking of which, it's weird that this boss has one of the more popular soundtracks. It sounds very Star Wars, which I guess fits the idea that they are a failed replication of the Great Ones. Honestly though, they should have taken this boss out and just stuck with Celestial Emissary. Number 19, Micolash, Host of the Nightmare. Should be last. F*** Micolash, that f***ing prick. A 10-minute chase gets rewarded with an insta-kill attack. From hearing that, you must think that you get to insta-kill Micolash, right? Wrong! He insta-kills you! Want my advice? Get poison knives, molotovs, everything you have, and cheese this bastard so hard that he becomes a Derrily Dunker. It genuinely baffles me that the 3 mandatory boss fights before the final boss are Rom, the One Reborn, and Micolash. People talk about the Dark Souls 1 drop-off in the second half, yet turn a blind eye against this horse shit. At least the lore's decent, and the soundtrack is nice and haunting, although this fight takes place in my least favourite area in the game, the Nightmare of Mensis. Like I said earlier, triggering arachnophobia is cheap, and it sincerely disappoints me that not even From Software are above it. Honestly, the only thing that I found somewhat fascinating about this boss was that he had 2 voice actors, and one of them is in the BBC show The Musketeers. Seriously, Ryan Gage plays King Louis, and somehow that character is less unlikable. Just think on that. Number 18, Witches of Hemwick. Another gimmick fight and another stinker. Nothing about this fight really stands out in a good way, it's just mostly mid. On your first attempt, you're guaranteed to have the mad ones in the arena with you. If you choose to fight them, then they're more difficult than the actual boss. If you choose to ignore them, they can quickly become a nuisance when several are there at the same time. If this was the fight, then at least it would just be forgettable. But at some point, a second Witch of Hemwick spawns with no health bar until one is dead. Then, you have to kill the other quickly, else they will resurrect the dead witch. This can turn the boss fight into a really annoying one, as you have to figure out which has the larger health bar so that you can take both down more easily. This is impossible to figure out until you see one of them. They look exactly the same, and all it does is add tedium. Definitely an incredibly easy fight, but that just makes it worse when you're spending a stupidly long time fighting them. Number 17, Blood-Starved Beast. Slow poison my arse. This is one of the quickest health drains I've ever seen to come from a poison in a video game. The Lake of Rot drains slower, Toxic in Dark Souls drains slower. I know what you're thinking, but that's because you're standing close to the boss. But that's my point. In Bloodborne, you have to be up close to the boss, because there are practically no alternatives. There are items leading up to the fight that can make it a lot easier to manage, but even then it doesn't take away from the fact that this is an annoying status effect. I've said it before and I'll say it again, bosses with status effects just make the fight even worse, literally every time. If you took it out of this fight, it would make the whole experience a lot better, because the rest of it is actually quite fun for an early game boss. The soundtrack has a good sting at the beginning, sounding like a horror jump scare, and it perfectly matches your reaction when you see the grotesque design of it for the first time. It honestly could have been a top 10 if it wasn't for that one mechanic that doesn't even live up to being slow poison. Number 16, Celestial Emissary. Yep, Bloodborne gimmick bosses are the worst. This is less of a fight, more of a game of guess who. The only difference is once you've guessed correctly, you get rewarded with a big chungus and a cool beyond. Who approved this move? I just want to talk. Just like the Witches of Hemwick and Micolash, this fight isn't tough in the slightest. Just another boss with cheap moves. But this one actually doesn't promote aggression, because look at how many of them you have to crowd control. Upper Cathedral Ward is a good level, let down by the fact that both bosses are quite underwhelming. At least the runback's good. Number 15, Lawrence, the first Vicar. The best lore. A great reason for doing a late game cleric beast. Let down by literally everything else about the fight. First of all, I don't believe in reskinning a base game boss for a DLC one. It just feels cheap and makes me feel hesitant to part with my money. Dark Souls 2 is Exhibit A on that. Secondly, that run back is atrocious. The closest lantern is the Hunter's Nightmare, where you'll have to endure several hunters and a big chungus. Also, I think there's a fiery boulder to survive as well, but my memory is hazy. Thirdly, the attacks just aren't it. You can't dodge Lawrence the same way that you could with the Cleric Beast because it's followed with a Path of Fire that can do quite a bit of damage. Once again, this doesn't follow Bloodborne's aggressive style, as you have to back up to stop the fire AoEs from hitting you, slowing the boss down to a crawl. Speaking of crawl, in Phase 2 he loses his legs and now lava is taking up half of the space. For a game where your dodge zips you around the room, it feels like that was a massive oversight for this boss. Not to mention he has a large health pool, meaning you're stuck here for a good 5 to 10 minutes just to kill Lawrence. Don't get me wrong, Lawrence is an incredibly challenging boss with or without these things. It's just that the ways you die to Lawrence usually feel like the game is trying to kill you, rather than fault at your own hand. Also, I know a lot of people love the soundtrack, but I'm not one of them. I think it's good, but also very unsatisfying. The way the violence builds up the tension and then nothing happens once it peaks? Nope, not for me. There's a remix between Lawrence and the Cleric Beast OST, and it actually feels like what Lawrence's theme should have been. Number 14, Shadows of Yharnam. Probably the best trio fight in FromSoft history. The Shadows of Yharnam still don't quite measure up to a lot of the great duo bosses. First of all, I don't like recycled soundtracks in a game, even if it makes sense in the lore. I'm no musical genius, but I know you can have the same tune and melody and just add different elements to make them stand out differently to each other. Monkey Island 2 is a good example of that. Hell, Elden Ring does this with all of the Godfrey and Merc fights. Hell, what did I just say about Lawrence and Cleric Beast? Second of all, I like how they went about the way each shadow fights. Two of them will try and be up close while one stays at a range, and their weaponry flows well between each other. The range fighter throws fire at you, one of them has a scimitar, and one has both a scimitar and a candle. This combined with a tombstone for crowd control makes the fight quite balanced. What takes away from that balance is the snake attack in Phase 2. Basically, when one of them gets below 40% health, they all go into Phase 2, with snakes coming out of them. It makes sense because the Forbidden Woods is full of them, but the attack where they summon the snakes is very unbalanced. They come out of nowhere in particular, and deal enough damage to insta-kill a player if they get caught. If the player is lucky enough to dodge the attacks, then chances are the snakes will just get summoned again. That really is the big thing that's holding the fight back. The run back isn't great, though not nearly as bad as people make it out to be. Forbidden Woods is a great area for farming, so getting through the enemies isn't too bad. We see these guys as regular enemies in the late game, which I'm usually not a fan of, and it does make me curious as to why they're in the Forbidden Woods of all places. That being said, the Shadows of Yharnam is a good boss, a good trio boss, but it still doesn't quite reach the potential it could. Number 13, Murga's Wet Nurse. The first of 3 final bosses in this game, Murga's Wet Nurse is a good boss, but is really underwhelming for a final boss. The soundtrack is haunting, but becomes very, very boring after the first minute. Think about Gravelord Nito's soundtrack. Now imagine that the only thing you heard was the piano. That's basically this soundtrack. It's neat that it's the same thing that plays when you use the Gascoigne music box though. Personally, I'm not a fan of the Black Smoke and the duo nurses. I like it when I see where I'm going, thank you very much. But at least the arena is open enough for that to barely be an issue, even if I think it goes on for way too long. There's nothing outright terrible to say about this boss, but there's nothing that stands out in an exceptional way either. Number 12, Abritus, Daughter of the Cosmos. I said that Upper Cathedral Ward was let down by 2 underwhelming bosses. This one isn't nearly as bad as Celestial Emissary, but still has a couple of BS attacks, those being the Call Beyond, obviously, and the Charge attack that has no tell. I do really like the lore of Abritus though, as it does foreshadow what might have happened in the fishing hamlet. You can tell that this being used to be something otherworldly, until someone decided to experiment on her. disfiguring her. But once again, this has one of my least favourite things about a boss: status effects. This time it's Frenzy, which is the Bloodborne equivalent of Curse/Deathblight. That's a lot worse than Not So Slow Poison. At least this boss is an optional late game challenge, and it's easier to avoid the Frenzy attack than the Blood-Starved Beast's poison. Once again, nothing terrible to say about this boss, but nothing that makes it stand out either. Number 11, Dark Beast Paul. Paul Grimes is either an early game challenge or a late game curb stomp. I like how targeting the limbs offer a brilliant advantage, and it gives a lot more openings to attack. I also like how cool the design looks, especially with the electricity. That same electricity can be a pain though, as Paul's attacks can deal a lot of damage if given the chance. That makes for a good balance, and pushes the aggressive playstyle that Bloodborne is known for. Overall, this fight is nothing particularly special, but I think it's still a solid representation of a beast fight in the game. Number 10, Cleric Beast. The very first boss of the game, the Cleric Beast definitely deserves the top 10 ranking. I love the foreshadowing of this boss, as you can hear the shriek from the ladder before the first lantern. Once you get to the bridge, you're caught off guard with this thing leaping over to fight you. It's such a cool design, and despite its name, nothing about it screams cleric. This isn't a bad thing, but rather a good implication that this beast used to be a human, and likely a member of the Healing Church. It's a good way of drawing the player to the lore of the game, while also giving them a pretty cool boss fight. I talked about how I preferred the music for this fight over the Lawrence fight, and it's simply because the melody sounds more satisfying to me. It's the perfect soundtrack to introduce the player to Bloodborne. My only criticism for this fight is both the run back and how narrow the bridge is. I'd be okay with the run back if it weren't for the wolves and the big guy before the fog gate, and I feel the bridge is a little too small for a boss of this size. It feels claustrophobic, but not in a good way. I can barely see anything when I'm wailing on the Cleric Beast's limbs, thanks to the camera angle. I had more trouble with the camera in Bloodborne than I did with the Nameless King, and the Cleric Beast is no exception. That being said, while there's another first boss that I've ranked higher, I think Cleric Beast does fit better as the first boss of the game. Number 9, Amygdala. After seeing these things littered around all of Yharnam, having one drop down and challenge you to a game of poker is intimidating. On the bright side, it has quite the poker face. Look at how pokeable that face is, Lady Gaga would be proud. Its arms are also easy to deal damage to, which promotes the idea of staying close to its face rather than under its legs. In a way, this feels like a prototype to the Dark Eater Medea boss from Dark Souls 3. Not only from the face being the weak spot, but also with the disco fever! It also takes a page from the Last Giant's book in Phase 2, as it will tear off its arms and beat you to death with them like Quan Chi in Mortal Kombat 9. I've spent a lot of this entry making jokes rather than giving it serious praise or criticism. I think that's rather the point. There's nothing in particular that makes it rank this highly, it's just solid all over the board. The only bad thing I could say about this boss is the Nightmare Frontier as an area, but there's a shortcut that takes you down to the fight, so I can't even say that. It just goes to show that the basic boss fights in Bloodborne are the finest examples of combat in a video game. And Amygdala would be much further down if the game didn't also contain several gimmick boss fights. Number 8, Moon Presence. Probably the most underrated boss fight in the game. The Moon Presence is the absolute final boss in Bloodborne. Everything about this boss is cool for one reason or another. The arena is one of the best in the series, the runback is perfect, the music is befitting of the situation, the lore has everything about the fight makes sense, the 1 HP sneeze is a good oh shit moment that encourages you to keep hitting the thing, and its design is a perfect mix of otherworldly and grotesque. Sure, it's not the hardest fight in the world, but that's the point. Just like Alant and Gwyn, the Moon Presence isn't the powerful creature it once was, because you consumed 3 umbilical cords, giving you the power equal to it. Now that it's picking on something its own size, it's desperate, hence the 1 HP sneeze. It's pulling off all the stops to kill you for good, but you're the damn hunter. The music isn't for the Moon Presence, it's for you. This is honestly the best implication of this type of boss, even if I prefer Gwyn overall. Moon Presence definitely deserves a lot more credit than people have given it in the past. Number 7, Vicar Amelia. Recycled soundtrack? Here we go again. By the way guys, it's pronounced Vicar, not Vicar. You fools. Everything else is pretty good though. A good arena, and this time there's no lava shit all over the floor. The design is honestly the most graceful beast design in the game, and that cutscene is disturbing in all the right ways. I'm not a big fan of the healing, but enough damage and it will be barely an inconvenience. In hindsight, I do think I might have ranked this boss a little too high compared to the others, but I really don't have anything bad at all to say about Vicar Amelia. She's not the hardest boss, the fight isn't on a massive scale, but she still functions well for what she is. Hell, she's the last boss before you see Ludwig's skull. I honestly think it's the cutscenes that bring the overall experience this far up on the ranking. That, and the fact that the design is more than just a deformed meatball. There is a jump between Amelia and the number 6 spot, but you'll see why that is. Number 6, Father Gascoigne. The first mandatory boss of the game, Father Gascoigne is the duality of the two most prevalent bosses in the game, that of a hunter and that of a beast. Considering how many hunter battles there are in this game, Father Gascoigne is the perfect introduction to what you're in for. Stupid gunshots, flinches at every successful strike, ability to parry with a firearm, and a fast-paced game of chess between two skilled hunters. Then phase 2 begins, and he turns into a beast. He's even faster than before, more erratic, but can still be parried. Also during this fight, he can use the music box to stun Gascoigne for some free attacks. The music for both these phases is phenomenal. I honestly think it's one of the best soundtracks in the entire series. It perfectly encapsulates the feeling that this is more than fighting a boss. This is surviving a villain from a horror film. The lore though, oh my, the lore is just tragic. You meet the child who says their mother went out to find their father. She wears a red jeweled brooch, and you see it on a corpse in the Father Gascoigne boss fight. Evidently, he did something terrible, and it's the reason why Gascoigne staggers at the sound of the music box. It's honestly the saddest story of the game, and if you tell the child what happened, they'll leave their home and die to the hands of a beast. What a messed up story. If there's one criticism I have for this boss, it's the runback. The fiery boulder? Damn, there's quite a few of those, aren't there? The elevator shortcut is good, but even then you have to pass like 7 enemies on a single bridge where the boulder is. Not terrible by any means, but it's a shame that they didn't give us consistently good runbacks until the next game. Still, this boss fight is so good that I'm having to grasp at straws to justify it not reaching the top 5. Number 5, Martyr Logarius. Speaking of bad runbacks, say hello to the one boss where you can't fight them with a full health bar with full heals. Full damage is guaranteed, and that's not taking into account that one guy who throws knives at you. Even then, this boss is cool as hell. Cutscene is intimidating as hell, the Burger King crown is glorious, the delay on his attacks makes the fight interestingly dynamic, and the ability to parry him to oblivion is always a welcome sight. Genuinely, I hear people complain about how much they hate Martyr Logarius, and I don't see what the problem can be apart from the runback. He can be fought straight after Vicar Amelia, so maybe people fought him underleveled? I fought him just before the DLC, so I probably gained the skill and levels needed to face him. But that's the beauty of the fight. You can fight him at a stupidly early level, or you can fight him when the playing field is just about even. He does have an attack in phase 2 where he places his sword down, and a tornado of swords frequently come to hit you. But that can be stopped by simply shooting the sword. The lock-on can go to the sword, so it's not impossible to figure out. His lore is pretty good too. He's hiding the Queen of the Vile Bloods because of his hatred for them using the old blood that he believes to be unholy. How do you uncover the secret? By wearing his Burger King crown, hell yeah! If we're being honest, Gascoigne and Logarius could be switched around, and it's down to preference as to which was the better experience. But now we're getting into the big 4 fights in Bloodborne, and quite a big jump in quality. Number 4, Orphan of Kos. The hardest fight I've ever done, including Millennia in that one. The Orphan of Kos is the ultimate boss in this game. Not necessarily the best, but everything comes together to make this boss. The final boss of the Old Hunters DLC, the Child of Kos who was name dropped by Micolash, the secret that Lady Maria tried to hide, the boss capping off the hardest area in the game, a balance of erratic and aggressive, a soundtrack that is both haunting and tragic, changing to one that is both intense and powerful, just like the Orphan itself. A disturbing design fitting that of the game, a unique arena that's embedded into the memories of every hunter that arrived there. It doesn't matter if you had any trouble with this fight or not. You can't deny that the Orphan of Kos is truly an experience unlike any other. Ironically, The biggest strength of this boss is also its greatest weakness. Bloodborne is the only game in the series which often of course works, but that also means that the slightest misjudgment in dodge timing means double damage, which will insta-kill the player in this fight. That might be what killed me the most honestly, and it's the only reason why the Orphan of Koth isn't in the top 3. It's an endurance fight for the ages, and one mistake could cost you everything. Not to mention some of his attacks linger, dealing enough chip damage to be a concern. Definitely not as unbalanced as Millennius BS, but still a skill check that will determine if you can rise to the occasion. Number 3, Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower. The first of 3 S-tier boss fights in this game, and honestly Lady Maria might be the most overrated. She's good, she's really good, but a lot of the hunter fights fall into the very similar movesets. Lady Maria looks like she'd be an exception, dual wielding swords, but nope, she still has a firearm, which are the most annoying parts of a hunter boss fight. You heal, gunshot. You dodge away, gunshot. You try to shoot them, gunshot. Sometimes you can parry them with it, but some of them happen so quickly that you have to be very lucky. But then phase 2 begins, and we get more sword, less gun. The music kicks in amazingly during this phase, and the blood acting as a lingering hitbox works as a way of giving you the same moves but narrowing the margin of error. Same goes for phase 3 where she adds fire to the blood, desperately pulling off all the stops to prevent you from seeing the secrets of the fishing hamlet. The lore is what elevates this fight from a great hunter fight like Father Gascoigne to a goated hunter fight like, well, we'll get to him soon. The pattern of the combat is probably at its best in this fight, as it feels like a dance between 2 skilled hunters, making moves to a rhythm, and if you don't quite get the pattern down, don't worry, the lantern is right outside the boss room, finally! It's a shame that you have to fight the living failures before getting to this boss, because I think just having a lantern here would be good enough. Definitely an S tier fight, and still my favourite version of the fast but staggerable girl bosses in the series. Number 2, Gehrman, the First Hunter. The best main game final boss in the series. There, I said it. He has the tragic tone like Gwyn, the challenging duel like Soul of Cinder, and a soundtrack that makes the fight rival Sif for the saddest in the series. The story of Gehrman is one of the best stories in any video game, and can be linked back to literally every boss and arena in this game. An old man who was once a legend, being the first hunter before the Healing Church had theirs. An apprentice in Lady Maria who he cared dearly for. Then one day, Lady Maria went missing after the events of the fishing hamlet, causing Gehrman to make contact with the moon presence, leaving him inside an eternity of his own misery and suffering. We don't fight Gehrman because we hate him, or because we want to hunt him down. We fight Gehrman to save him from his suffering, but Gehrman won't let us suffer his fate. So he will take us down one last time, grabbing his scythe and giving us the most badass line in the series.
Tonight, Gehrman joins the hunt.
The fight itself does have one of my criticisms of the guns that the hunters use, but everything else is near perfect. Could he have been a little harder? Sure, but he's still tough enough to be an epic fight. One that brought me down to my last blood vials. And even though I complained about the guns, Gehrman's is actually quite easy to time for a good parry, which puts him over the Lady Maria fight for me, although barely. The question we should ask ourselves is, what could possibly top Gehrman? The boss would have to tick every single box with flying colours, have minimal downsides, and be in contention for the best boss in the series. Number 1, Ludwig the Accursed / Holy Blade. The 2 best cutscenes in the game, the best soundtrack in the game, a better duality between Hunter and Beast than even Father Gascoigne, lore that is both tragic and legendary, a run back that is barely noticeable, all topped off with a design that encapsulates everything the boss is about. Ludwig the Accursed kills so many people that the blood streams all the way down the Hunter's nightmare. His opening cutscene is intimidating, as a bloodied person begs for help, until he begs for mercy at the sight of Ludwig, laughing hysterically as the beast shrieks. I'll be honest, Ludwig's first phase isn't perfect. The delayed jump attack is a pain to time and dodge, and some of his tells are too small and sudden to react to, but that could be chalked down to my own skill issue. Ludwig to me is the second hardest boss fight in the game, just behind Orphan. His erratic attacks can make or break new players, but he leaves us with openings and opportunities to attack his limbs, maybe even getting a critical strike on him. Also, once he got his first attack down, you get several free hits from the start. It's probably the best beast fight in the game, taking elements from the others and making them a little more well balanced. But then you get to phase 2. Ludwig the Accursed falls down, never to get up again, as a turquoise light brings back the Ludwig of old. Even as his beast, his humanity returns. He holds his sword one last time, his true mentor, his guiding moonlight. That's right, the Moonlight Greatsword, From Software's signature weapon, returns in this DLC, and with genuine lore significance. The music kicks in, and this is hands down the best soundtrack in FromSoft history, as well as one of the best in gaming history. Ludwig the Holy Blade has returned for one final duel. The moveset has completely changed, and the things that worked against the beast no longer work here. His erratic attacks now coming from a place of his own skill rather than savagery. The lighting of the Moonlight Greatsword really adds to the aesthetics of this fight, and the attacks are well balanced and have a great variety. Even when you put Ludwig down, it's not over yet. You get to have one last conversation with the Holy Blade. He will ask you if his hunters are the noble warriors he aspired for them to be. If you tell him the truth, he will die in terror, but if you're like most of us, you can't bring yourself to do so, and so you lie, giving him a peaceful death. Then you get his Moonlight Greatsword! The fact that Ludwig is the first boss of the DLC just speaks volumes as to how good the Old Hunters DLC is, and it's probably why so many people have such a fond memory of it. And that's the ranking. Do you agree with this list? Let me know in the comments. Also, please like and subscribe. It would seriously help me out, more than you could possibly know. Until next time, my friends,